We had started to talk about
Oh, yes.
hedonic
Tone,
tone,
always associated with emotion.
and we were talking about the fact that you can't avoid suffering.
Yeah, that seems to be the consensus among all people who have anything. I know this is a prejudiced point of view, but anybody who has any kind of objective observation of the world, to be a fleshy being, to certainly probably to be any other kind of being too. I mean, we hit a lobster scream when it's thrown into the boiling water.
Mm.
So to be a sensate being is to be in a world that by its nature just is loaded with all kinds of dangers and tragedies, unfortunately. Lots of ways to get hurt and to die or to become hurt slowly over the year. There's so many ways. I mean, focusing just on the human world to make it easier. Think of what happens to us. We can have the most grand life of all and still die under horrible conditions. Like take Ronald Reagan. He died eventually from his Alzheimer's condition. Now, he was actor and president, liked or not liked, called Saint Reagan by some people, vilified by others, etc., etc. It doesn't matter, but he lived what they would call obviously a life of celebrity and power and lots of fun, no doubt, because power is fun for people. And he wound up with Alzheimer's. You can only imagine what it would be like for him,
Mm.
relieving himself in a diaper and not even knowing how.
Mm.
I mean, the brain will just disappear in most of its human form, and you just become reduced to the life of a defecating vegetable.
Mm.
Sad to say, and that's only one way to go. There are lots and lots of very bad ways to go. So the fact is that no matter how wonderful everything is, as I've said many times on these tapes, every equation ends in 0,
Mm-hmm.
and so there are lots of ways for the ending to come. But people who are simply observant, people who do what I call Buddha work or awareness work, know that by its nature, life is very difficult. It's a struggle, said Nietzsche, Buddha, and Jesus, and untold others. It's struggle, and in many, many cases, it hurts.
Mm-hmm.
And you realize that if you got osteoarthritis or something like that. And you can do everything you can to keep yourself going well, but it's there, and unfortunately, lots of us don't know how to deal with it very well, and so many of us die of opioid overdoses, or we get sick unto death through them.
Trying to escape.
Yeah, there's another aspect. I mean, you talk about whatever you want. You're the guy with the brains today.
Well, so within that, is there a way that plays against the hedonic tone
What plays
concept?
against it?
That the avoidance of suffering, the suffering itself, the
Oh,
aspect of living as a fleshy being in this level of reality.
the escape, lots of good rational people would agree with this. The escape means escape from physical pain.
Mm.
And if you realize that everything, we don't have to have a mind and a body. That was thrown out by the philosophers hundreds of years ago. It's not
Separate.
mind and a body. No, it's mind body, and the body is like this ball of energy that seems to have coalesced for a while, and it's producing all kinds of radiation off, and some of them are called thoughts, and lots of lots of feeling. I mean, this atomic structure is full of this seemingly unanswerable anomaly, which they call human consciousness, human awareness. How did that just basic material stuff produce a consciousness? Well, maybe because there is consciousness there. That's what Hameroff says and others, right? Enormous consciousness. Only we just are the tiniest expression of it, but some more than others. like Hawking or someone like that, an Einstein, or some of the great mystics who had a vision of the whole thing and lived in the security of that without the fear of death and all the rest of the stuff that comes with this ordinary egoic centralized sense of self. We turn these radiating energy balls into things that are seen by the other. We live in the eyes of the other. We're so dedicated to being made significant and but fundamentally to be recognized,
as opposed to recognizing a being as a fluctuating conscious entity.
That's good. And the fluctuation, let's say, takes place in the world of behaviors, so that you've got to be pretty damn consistent to satisfy a lot of people out there with your behavior. So you have to disarm yourself and things like that. And if you're a crazy Sicilian, you want to kill everybody. That's not easy.
Right.
That's really not me. I've never had that impulse, but the shadow does. That's why in my novels there's lots of murders, and there's a sense of revenge. And as a good true Sicilian, I always put revenge into a couple of my movie books.
And so going into the shadow work portion of this too, and maybe going further into the hedonic tone idea, how does one first even observe their subconscious tendencies, their shadow? How does one observe that, and what does one do with that once they do observe it? How does one become better?
Excellent
or, I suppose,
question, because that's the key to all this. People can hear all this and say, yeah, okay, that's perennialism, that's Jungian psychology, that's Zen, that's Gnosticism, that's Taoism, that's existentialism. Absolutely right. If they've studied any and all of those things, they'll recognize that all of this comes out of it. But the real question is, how do you begin to improve yourself? What do you have to do? Should I go to a Zen monastery and sit? How severe should it be? Should I go every Wednesday evening for a couple of hours? Or should I actually join a Zen community and live there, do a retreat, for a long time? Should I get up at 5 a.m. and go sit? That kind of thing. It depends on what you want to do. But the most fundamental way to do it is through the sly man, the way that Gurdjieff would talk about it, Krishnamurti advocates. And that is to pay attention every moment, as many moments as you can. You fail, go back. I fell asleep. So what? The next moment is there for you. That's what you are. You are always this unrolling moment.
So essentially, to use terminology that people would be familiar with, you're essentially always in a meditative state.
If you can't, that's what Krishnamurti would call meditative. You try to pay attention. You do what the Moody Blues said. Make the journey out and in. You don't give up on the world. You live in the world, but the sly man is meditating. What does that mean? The people just laugh at you. You're paying attention to yourself. And wouldn't it be advantageous to be awake to yourself during a very strong conflict? It can save you from getting yourself beat up by somebody superior to you physically, or if you are superior, can save you from the consequences of hurting somebody else. And
emotionally or physically, even.
I mean, personally, you might say that it can disarm you under certain circumstances, and I can agree, but that's not real. That's not really the meditation. What you're seeing there is, there's a difference between the negative self-consciousness. See, some people would say, you're just sissy self-consciousness. No, this is more fundamental. It's primary. You're paying attention to your gut, your feelings. You pay attention to your body.
You're merely feeling, to no more of a degree, it would seem, than you're feeling your ass underneath you while you sit.
There you go.
It doesn't seem, there's no judgment taking place on what you're doing. You're not creating more and more layers to go through. You're removing layers.
Fully agree. And so for the viewer now, don't be discouraged, because that sounds like you're some kind of a high mystic. But the fact is that you will see that judgment takes place even at the most fundamental level. Okay? You use the example of my ass on the seat.
Mm-hmm.
There's a judgment going on. Is it pleasant? Yeah, it's pretty good. It's soft, comfortable. There's no bony ass. Right. And if it weren't comfortable, you'd see this behavior coming out of the judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And think of all the things you perceive. Are you interested? I mean, if I'm tired at night, but I know I'm not going to sleep, I sit in my study with the TV on, and I'll just go through channels 100 times in 5 minutes. I'll go from one thing. Is there a scene where there are human people talking to each other in a way that interests me? I don't need to see the car chases, the explosions, the gigantic monsters.
Right.
I would love to see human interaction. There's so much that's dissolving about human beings, and people are falling into the terrible trap of the selfies, and it's all about this single narcissistic entity that depends so much on being made significant by the eyes of the other.
And not only that, but even just fulfillment in general, in self-indulgence. And you wrote an allegory once about the Grand Canyon of Desire, and it's the same with Netflix as it is with selfies. It's the never-ending search for fulfillment through whatever value system has been created in your lifetime.
You know, you're so right. I like to use this because I'd like to feed the hungry. But if I had $1 for every selfie that's been taken in this world, I could probably feed the hungry for a couple of months in this world. Now, how many trillions of selfies are taken every year? It's got to be, well, many billions, am I right?
Yeah. You got to get the right angle. It's getting better now. The technology is getting better, so you can recognize the lighting and the composition of the picture much better. You know, to summarize all of this stuff, it's very, very simple. It all comes down to getting back into the moment and not being so separate from it through judgment, and not placing an idealization on what things should be based on your thoughts.
I agree. May I throw in something with this? For people who hear this kind of talk and realize that it may be a good avenue for them, it's a wide highway, actually, because nobody's asking you to do anything different. Lay not a finger on life, says Zen,
right.
But pay attention to it. They can make a choice. I mean, if they're inclined, you have some people who are very ambitious and others who are not, and all that, right? Then they can make a choice to go study, because this kind of enterprise is most sanguine, beneficial when you do it in the company of others. That's very important. We are not separate beings anyway. We're the bubbles on the ocean, you know, the way I speak of it. And so we only think we're separate, but we're the grapes of wrath. We're the grapes of like 500. How did I describe it? You walk into this. The ancient one took the traveler into this gigantic bell-shaped building. They open the door and they walk in, and it's like it's 100 yards in diameter, and so 50 yards away, the traveler sees this strange thing. It looks like a vine that's growing out of the ground, and it goes right up to the top of the bell. The whole thing is empty, and then you look and you find that as you get closer, they're all human size, the size of human beings. They're all the grapes. It's covered with grapes, 1,000 grapes or more, and they all have human faces, and they're all carrying knives and swords, and they're cutting and slashing at each other, and they're screaming in death throes or just screaming. Wow, what is this? Well, you know what it is. It's the human condition.
That they're all attached to each other.
Yeah, so attached. They come out of the same root. They're just different a little bit. Some are different color.
And so it's the act of observation and getting back into the moment is the act of realizing the interconnected nature of existence.
That's a good secondary movement of it, and I applaud it. But the first act is just the attention. It's
Mhm.
it's the most difficult, and people have to understand. They say, yes, I'm observing, and then immediately they don't realize it, but they stopped.
Mm.
They fall asleep again. That's part of the trap. This is very difficult. It requires a very light touch to oneself. You see, it is for people who are just grinding it out and pushing it with your heavyweight people. This is kind of like a different kind. This is certainly a different kind of effort, and it's a tentative effort, and it's not a self-conscious neurotic effort. It's an attempt to simply be awake to the moment. And if you're a martial artist, you'd understand this, because you don't function unless you're awake, internally and externally. So you flow.
I want to segue from that and include that idea. I have found that having done so many physical forms of practice, it's very easy to get drawn into neurotic tendencies in a lot of the physical practices, and there is a huge difference between being in a state of flow and being in a neurotic practice. The, also, off of that, I think it is a betrayal of the body to go down a route that turns someone into a high level competitor. It is to say that one aspect of being a human being and enjoying one aspect of, say, physical development, that it supersedes another, and that betrays what the human organism is best at doing, which is adaptation to imposed demands. So you say, I'm only going to place myself under these demands so that I am only good at this thing, so that I can measure myself against another person that is also under those same conditions. It is a complete betrayal of being a human being.
I don't know where. I guess I can understand why you've come to this. We seem to have a lot in common in terms of the thought process. But I never mentioned this to you, probably, but if you ever read A Course in Miracles, which in itself would be an education, you would find at some point in there it says to use the body for physical attack is a sin.
Mm.
Of course. I mean, the grapes of wrath, look at them, they're killing themselves, oneself, they're killing mirror images.
Right.
You can understand it, and this is not by any means an attempt to put a philosophy at the foundation of the political party known as the Democrats, because they have lost. Let me put it this way: I read the young Marx when I was doing research for my doctorate. I spent many hours in the John D. Rockefeller Library at Brown, and I read lots of books on lots of material, I should say, in the form of 4 or 5 different books on the young Marx, and everything about him was like a nature mystic, the oneness of all things. I remember that. He wasn't the only one. Feuerbach, Schelling, I think, people you've never heard of and will ever hear of again, and I don't travel in those circles anymore. But some of those old German philosophers were really connected to the idea of nature and the unity of things, the unification of things, and Marx was one of them. He wrote like a nature mystic, and it was very poetic. He was talented, and then he did the Das Kapital, which is the critique on capitalism, and a very good one. But then his solution, the classless society, doesn't work. And anybody who thinks it will work because it's America just is ignorant. Look at the classless societies of Russia, where the millions and millions are murdered, or the millions and millions murdered by Mao Zedong in China, or Pol Pot, who killed almost half the population of Cambodia. Well, 3 million out of 7 million he murdered, tortured to death in many cases. I mean, this is what they don't they don't recognize simply is that you're going to put human beings at the head of a social order that you think is by its nature pure, and nothing is safe from human corruption.
Right.
And you keep proving it because the individual, by his nature, is a friggin' separated bubble, suffering from ontological loneliness, which he thinks he can overcome with power and money and various stimulations of all the sexual functions, the exploitation of the body.
Right.
How the current dictator of North Korea's father died. Oh, serving the nation. No, he's on a train. He used to have his 2 or 3 beautiful young Korean sex toys, and cigars and champagne. He just lived his life, and then he croaked. That lifestyle killed him when he was like, I don't know, 50, 60, something like that. These people are supposed to be the leaders of a society which has virtue built into its social structure, and it's horse shit. It's pure unadulterated. I mean, really, and that's because of the individual. You cannot legislate brotherhood and sisterhood.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot legislate it. You cannot do that through. You have to do it through your own, as we discussed one time. You have to find your compassion. When you find compassion for yourself and you realize suffering is part of your life, and if you break a leg or something like that, suddenly you understand that even more sharply, okay? And you go through all kinds of terrible things in a hospital, then you realize, hey, wait a minute, and if you have any kind of heart, you think, I'm not the only one suffering. In fact, there are millions of people suffering more than this right now, and there are millions and millions of animals suffering.
But you'd have to get out of the egoic, normal, self-serving state in order to do that, right? You'd have to climb Maslow's hierarchy from the bottom, right?
Well, in a sense, you probably can for a moment in the thought.
Right.
Now, let's not say that just because you have a thought, you suddenly attain to a higher level, because I've seen that horse manure
Sure.
come out of so-called enlightened people
Sure.
in Massachusetts.
No, it would be a feeling, right? It would be a
Well, what
going
it
back to
is
the hedonic tone.
Yeah, I mean, if you can, if it's that strong, but the whole point is that you have an insight, you have an understanding for a moment, you have a thought that stops you, okay, and it's maybe the progenitor of other thoughts like it, or maybe it just goes away and you go back to being the same fool that you were before. You probably will be the fool. It's not like you're just going to transform into some kind of higher being. Meditation is an observation. It's the act of being what you are, who you are, which is what? Awareness.
Just being.
That's what
Just
you
being.
are. You are awareness. Your body you could talk about. I am a body. Yes, you are a body, but the body is a field of awareness. It feels. It's by its nature. It's sensate,
Mm-hmm.
and because of that, this is where you find your true identity. In the fundamental senses of your body. What? It's awareness. Oh, some people, I could name one great philosopher, Thomist philosopher, said, oh, it's a downward ecstasis. No, it's not. When you pay attention, be a good girl. Well, do the impossible. But when you realize that you are fundamentally this primary sense of consciousness that has all kinds of secondary structures pouring out of it, thought process and all that, and then the bad, which is the delusion of the separateness between the mind and the body, and that always carries, and that's why there is so much narcissism. You know, these little creatures, very instinctual. This little girl, as our other Chihuahua, would run up to another dog, sniff its nose, then snap at it. No matter, and especially big dogs. Oh yeah, they want to kill the big dogs. Why? Well, that's their insecurity. But they don't suffer from if they run away, screaming because the big dog's going to kill them. They don't suffer from like ongoing shame.
Right. You know, a thought that I've had about humans interacting with other humans. I've been playing off this thought for the last few videos that we've been doing. Imagine that we all share the same consciousness, as we've constantly discussed, but on say a lower level of awareness, not so universal level, a more let's just say the planet-based level. Like, imagine we are the brain of the planet. We're all neural synaptic firings in the brain of the planet, and we would have to play off of each other in order to make things work. It's we're totally interconnected with the planet on every other level.
That's right. Well, yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. We are the brain of the planet. We certainly are the intellect.
We're the neural synaptic connections of the planet,
Yeah.
not even the whole brain.
Yeah.
The human organism maybe would be the whole brain. The human and the entire structure of a human entities.
You mean all the members?
All of them, yeah.
All the members?
Yeah, it
Yeah.
would be them.
Well, yeah. I mean, but that's Teilhard de Chardin's theory.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is put in the category of unprovable
Mm-hmm.
and improbable.
Right.
Because it doesn't eventuate. He thought that it was going to be happening. You know, he called it a Christ consciousness, if I remember right, and read him 50 years ago.
And that there would be an occurrence of something.
Pardon me?
There would be an occurrence of something, some kind of.
There would be,
awakening.
and there's other people too, like Fox and the coming of the cosmic Christ and things like that. You can hear what's being said, that there's going to be an elevation of the human condition. Maybe.
I think I mean certainly
Maybe, but it will take a great crisis.
has this not happened? Have things like that not? I mean, where we are in human history now compared to where we were 300 years ago is like incredibly different in terms of, let's just say, information. Just
Well,
in terms of information.
certainly that, and maybe there are more people with the value system of a higher state of not only human consciousness, but a higher state of Gaia consciousness. You know, maybe there are more people because there is so much interconnection of communication. Maybe that's true, but I don't know if that number is enough to survive. Are they going to be the ones who survive a great calamity? Maybe some of them will survive, but it's so tricky. I don't know if it's ever really happened. It seems like the Earth could have had many civilizations.
Right.
And there are people who claim that.
Right, and also, as I had discussed with you last time, I don't know if we're completely capable with our biological mechanisms and flaws within those of reaching a point of interstellar travel, going beyond our conflicts and our limitations of our organism, but perhaps robots in the next generation of the thing that takes over the planet.
Some people are talking about that. But again, I put this in my allegories. Remember? The wanderer was going through the desert where he lived for many episodes, and he came upon a city. He went inside and he came upon what looked like human beings, but then they disclosed to him eventually that they were not human beings, that they were mechanical people. They were and they expressed responses that were appropriate. They were programmed to be highly intellectual, etc., etc. But at one point, he asked one of the robots, a very pretty female robot, about whether she was really alive. And she said, well, I think, yes, I'm alive. I've been told I'm alive. Well, to be alive means that you have to feel and be awake to your feeling. And he said, if I kiss you on the lips, I know you would probably have an appropriate response, but would you actually feel it? And she said, I do not understand that question. Obviously she wasn't. He realized that it didn't matter that they looked so much like they were human. There was what people would call a soul. There's no awareness and a self-awareness. There was none of that. It was just all very highly complex mechanical responses, electronic responses produced by superior technological beings, but there's nobody home. Okay? And then he, you remember his response? So no, and he's dying of ontological loneliness. That's why he's in a desert. He's going from one episode to another, and here he is. He's talking to things that he's like talking to the toaster.
Right.
and I saw an episode of Charlie and his brother Alan, and Alan's dark side, his shadow came out, and he used to talk to him from a mirror or even from the toaster. And one day he's just goading him on to be a crooked, thieving son of a gun. Hilarious. They did, in my opinion, very good medical therapeutic work. They did lots and lots of medical
What show
work.
was that?
2.5 Men.
2.5 Men.
Which is virtually, to me, the funniest of all the sitcoms that ever existed.
So I wanted to go back really quick. In closing of this video.
My done?
Nah.
Oh my God, I don't have any purpose.
To summarize, hedonic tone, the nature of suffering, and what to do with it. Your work, your final papers in college that you created were in body consciousness.
Graduate school.
Graduate school.
Yeah, my doctoral dissertation really rested on you don't want to hear this. It rested on a flaw I found in Jean-Paul Sartre's Being a Nothingness, where he actually couldn't help but make a separation between body consciousness and the self-awareness consciousness. And there was I found a hole in that flaw, and that was the key. And because of that, I was able to open up the two and to show that if you dispel all the